Good morning and welcome to BLIXX All About Horses and Their Care, where our motto is companionship, care, and commitment. I'm your host, Gabriela Rodriguez, and today our show is a series called Your Horse's Future. We've done a couple of episodes already, and today the show is going to be about when your horse dies and your options and what you need to do and what you need to be aware of. We have a guest today who's returning for the second time, and today we're going to focus on composting. Our guest is Bill Seekins, and Bill is with the Maine Department, or used to be, he's retired from the Maine Department of Agriculture. He's a compost researcher and founder and director of the Maine Compost School. So I'm going to just recap for a second the last time, and people can view these shows, all the shows on BLIXX Horses on YouTube. And the last show we talked a lot about burial because that seems to be a very popular option still, but there's a lot of information that people need to know, horse owners need to know about burial and why it may not be the best thing to do for a lot of different reasons that Bill is going to go into. Composting is happening more and more, and it's a very good way of giving you a better result with your animals than, say, burial is. The other option when you have a horse or an animal that dies is to cremate, and I have one of my horses here in this box, which is a 50-pound box of ashes. And there really isn't anything that you can do with ashes. You can keep the ashes. They are a struggle to move, as people here at the studio found out when we had to take the ashes or the box out of the car and bring it into the studio. So there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to things, and you really need to have good information in order to make those very important decisions. It's interesting in barns that we talk about so many things. We talk about saddles, we talk about shows, we talk about the horses, all the things that we use on our horses' mane and tail, but we never talk about our horses dying and what we're going to do. And it's very interesting to me that very few times when I have taken my horses to boarding facilities has anybody approached me and asked me what I plan to do if my horse dies in that facility. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill, and I'd like to introduce everybody to Bill again. Thank you for coming to the show. You have a very good presentation on composting, something that is probably the wave of the future and something that's very good for the environment, something that actually does a lot of good for the soil instead of hurting the soil and the water. So can I just send it over to you now, and can you start with your presentation on composting?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I think this is a topic that is, the timing is right. People need to know more about this, and so I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk with you about it. My presentation is called Composting for Horse Operations, but we are going to touch a little bit on burial as well at the end.
Yes.
So I'll focus first on the composting aspect. Before I talk specifically about composting horses, I want to talk a little bit about what composting is in general.
Okay.
And there are 3 points that I like to make. One is that it's a natural biological process that uses microbes that are naturally occurring in the environment. It's an aerobic process, meaning that you like to have as much of the activity be based on oxygen rather than an anaerobic or environment without oxygen.
Okay.
It's an exothermic process, means that it generates heat. So if the process is working correctly, the temperatures in the pile get up to 130 degrees or higher,
Right.
Which is important for things like pathogen reduction and weed seed kill in the medium itself. So when you're done the process, the material is safe to use and is not going to contribute to any weed problems in the environment.
Right.
So some of the inputs and outputs in a compost process in general, you start out with some organic material, anything that was once part of a plant or animal. You have to have oxygen in the environment. You have to have the microbes that I just mentioned, and you have to have sufficient moisture for the process to work.
Right.
And what comes out of it is a humus-like, soil-like material that's rich in nutrients and water-holding capacity, and is a good soil builder.
Yeah, and I've noticed that I've seen dirt from composting, and it's very black and very, very rich looking. It's very different from other soils that you might take a look at.
Most of your soil in Maine is kind of a pale brown color. You add the compost, and suddenly, boom, it brings the color out, and,
Yeah,
and
it's
it
very pretty.
improves the texture and many other aspects of the soil.
Yep.
So those are the primary things you need to be aware of. Composting will generally result in just carbon dioxide and water as vapor that come off the pile. So there's no odors from a compost pile.
And that's very important for
performing-
people to understand that, yeah.
Right. If it's performing correctly, then you're not going to have a lot of odors that come off there.
Right.
And as I said, it's exothermic, it generates heat, and this is just a shot of a thermometer that shows a compost pile that we composted in 2001 in December, and you can see it's 145 degrees. This is a carcass compost pile that we did in December 2001.
And you said it should be at least 130 degrees, right? So
Right,
this is well over
for
that.
pathogen kill,
Yeah.
but generally you get temperatures much higher
I
than
would
that.
think, yeah. Okay.
And this is a typical compost pile. You can see the way the air comes in on the left. There's a highly compacted zone at the bottom. And then you can see the core of the pile where it gets really hot, where can you see the difference in the color in the core?
Yeah.
So when you have a carcass in there, it's going to be in that core where the heat is and where the high level of activity
Okay,
is.
and there is a carcass there.
Well, not in this
there?
particular
There
pile.
isn't.
No,
Okay.
No, but I wanted to give you a sense of what the structure of any compost pile
Okay,
is.
so it's like a mound.
Right.
And it has to be that way, right? Because the animals that we're talking about, horses particularly, that's the bulk of their weight right in the center,
Right.
right?
That's
So
correct.
it would make sense, okay.
Yeah, and one of the other things that we see is the compost pile creates what's called a chimney. If you look at the top, you can see the zone where the heat and moisture exit the pile. That's the chimney, and right. So in that area right there.
Okay.
And that's typical of whether there's a carcass in there or not.
Okay.
The pile heats, it draws air in through the bottom, and the air that exits the top is going to be hot and moist.
Okay.
And so a lot of the moisture leaves that way. So you can see steam coming off from the hot
Okay.
air coming out.
You have a lot of different piles. That looks like there may be more shavings in the pile next to
yeah,
it?
these were trials using different materials.
Because
and-
you researched all of this in order to be able to...
We've done a lot of research looking at different materials for composting different types of animal carcasses.
And you found that what works best?
Well, one of the best things is horse bedding, especially if you have a little bit of waste feed to mix in to give it a little more energy, works terrific.
Waste feed as in manure?
Well, no, it would be like spoiled silage or grains that haven't been eaten, or some wet hay or mix in there. Something that adds a little bit more energy to the sort of shavings bedding.
And most people have that. Most people that have
And
horses
that's,
have
most of that's right there on site. There are a number of different composting methods, but the only two that we're really interested in are what's called passively aerated piles, and then you have something that's called a preconditioned and turn system.
Okay.
This is a passively aerated pile. In this particular one, we put some pipes underneath to allow more air to go in. You don't necessarily have to do that as long as you have enough coarse material. Then the pile will heat, it'll draw the air into the pile by itself.
Okay. So what's that pile made? What's it mostly composed of?
Well, in this particular one, you can see it's mostly animal bedding, and then you can see there's some hay in
I
there.
see that. Okay.
And that pile will heat up on its own.
Yeah.
There's a carcass in there that obviously you can't see.
Right.
And the pile itself provides the energy for the bacteria to decompose
Okay.
that. The carcass provides some energy itself, some of the moisture that you need.
Yeah.
And then you have a pretty rapid breakdown. Normally, in 10 to 12 weeks, you're mostly down to just bone.
Okay. Wow. It doesn't take very long because the comparison to burial is that you can look in the ground and
Months or even years down the road and find parts of, or sometimes nearly whole animals.
yeah, and that's very important for people to know because I think most people don't realize that.
Right.
And professionals maybe as well. So that's a very good point.
Right. So,
Okay.
Yeah, so it does take a much longer time in the soil because it's cooler, there's lack of oxygen. So the preconditioned and turn system is similar to the static aerated pile, except that you turn it after 10 to 12 weeks. Once the primary breakdown is done, you turn that, and so all of those nutrients that are concentrated in the middle now get distributed through the whole medium.
Okay.
And then it will reheat, and then you can actually make a really nice product
Okay.
from that at the end.
So when you say turn, that means that you have to get some kind of probably piece of machinery, right?
You would need
Because you need to
a
turn.
tractor with a bucket on it. And
Okay.
not everybody is going to be able to do that. So
Right.
they're just going to do a passively aerated system. But
Okay.
if you have the capability of
Mm-hmm.
turning and getting those nutrients mixed into the whole medium,
Mm-hmm.
then you have a more uniform product, and it'll heat faster and cook quicker after the turning. So you
Okay.
might turn it 2 or 3 times in the lifetime of that pile.
Okay.
When it's done, you're going to have this nice, rich, brown, uniform material
Okay.
to use in the soil.
And that happens within 10 to 12 weeks. And the other method where you don't do the turning, about how long does it take there?
Well, it'll take, the initial breakdown will be about the same amount of time. But because you haven't moved all of that dry materials on the outside into the core and you haven't gotten the nutrients distributed, you won't have as nice uniform a product.
Okay.
So it will be less attractive as a material to use.
But the end result will be probably just bone
Right.
that's left.
Right.
And maybe it won't be as rich looking. Is that what you
Well,
mean?
it'll look, you'll have lumps and it'll be kind of chunky. There's going to be uncomposted material from the bedding and the hay that's out near the surface that never got the advantage of being in the core.
Okay. But as far as the animal goes, for
The
people
animal
that,
will be the same condition. There'll be
Okay.
virtually nothing.
okay, because
left
most
but
people
bone.
probably don't want to see any parts of their horses
No,
after
no.
this process has been done, so you want to try to do it right the first time.
Right,
Right?
right.
Okay. And for a lot of horse owners that I don't have tractors.
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 horses and a small property, so I have access, but I don't have this type of machinery. And a lot of people are like me. So if we were to think about doing composting, the other the other method would be the best,
Well,
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
the static.
The static, right?
The
Okay.
passive, yeah.
And I'm having a lot easier time talking about this than I did on our first show.
Oh, good.
I'm very happy to say that. Yes.
Good. Yeah,
It makes
it's
a lot
not
of
it's not an
sense.
easy topic to think about even. So
No, but it's important because if you have a horse and you have that horse for life, your horse is going to die, hopefully before you do. So you have to figure out and have a plan.
right.
Okay.
So just quickly, siting. An ideal site is going to be one that's not within a sensitive watershed, which means you're not going to be in an area where you're going to be affecting somebody's water supply. Or anything. A distance from a neighbor, a distance from any water bodies, and from wells. Ideally, you don't want it to be visible from the road,
Okay.
but nearby so that you can manage it.
Okay.
Nearly level ground, not in a drainage area, not on a floodplain, and not close to your property line.
Okay.
So, you'd like to have deep soils. That isn't always possible. And soils that have good permeability means that the water won't puddle on it, but you don't want it to be so permeable that it's going to just rush right down into the groundwater.
A little complicated.
Yeah, well, I mean, the idea is, I mean, you kind of look for the ideal, and then we'll move on. But the reality is you keep all those things in mind and pick the best spot you have.
Right, and do it before your horse dies. Try to make a plan, which
Right.
a lot of us forget to
I'm
do.
having trouble getting this to move on. There we go.
Okay.
So, the last point there, the reality, most of the time, site is a compromise driven by the most pressing concern and practicality.
Okay.
So you just have to find the best site that you have, keeping all those things in the back of your mind.
Okay.
So this is what's in the rule. The Chapter 211 rule says you have to have 24 inches to the seasonal water table.
Okay.
So whatever the bottom of the pad, or the top of the pad, wherever the animal is sitting, you have to have at least 24 inches from there
Okay.
to the seasonal water table and to bedrock. And if there's sand and gravel, you've got to have at least 18 inches before you reach the sand and gravel.
Okay.
So you have a similar situation with burial, but instead of being down in the soil, you're above the soil.
Right, right, which is a lot easier.
Right. And so you can actually put a little fill in to get you above the water table if you need to, for
Right.
instance.
Right. And this is a lot better for all the way around than burial is.
Right. When I talk about burial, I'll address that point a little
Yes.
bit more. But,
Okay.
So what do you do to compost a large animal? The first thing is you need to find that you have enough of a medium to work with, which is usually the animal bedding. And it normally takes about 12 cubic yards of material for an animal the size of a horse.
Okay.
You know, and of course, if you have a very large horse, a work horse, it's going to take significantly more.
Right.
And I'll show you a little chart later on that,
Okay.
that I used to do the calculation. But
Okay. But what if you don't have a lot of used bedding? For example, in the summertime, I don't use a lot of bedding because one of my horses has a lot of allergies to the dust. So what do you do? Do you go to the manure pile where there's hay and bedding and use some of that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you use what you have on hand.
Okay. And everybody has a manure pile
Right.
if you have horses.
And you know, when I say bedding, I'm talking about used bedding
Okay.
that has manure
That's
in
important.
it. So
Okay.
it has, you know, the urine and the feces in there
Yeah.
because those things actually help drive the process. They provide nutrients and they provide some of the organisms that you need to make the process go. So that's
Yeah.
what I'm talking about, rather than fresh new bedding that
Right.
hasn't gone in.
Let me ask you this. So everybody has a manure pile, and the deeper the manure pile is, the hotter it is, right?
You know, up to a point,
Typically?
yeah.
So do you excavate down just a little bit to try to get some of the deeper?
Not necessarily. I think you can take whatever, you know, whatever's, actually the fresher, the newer stuff is better
Oh,
than,
okay.
than the older stuff.
Okay, all right.
so-
Well, that's very simple because everybody has that.
Yeah. And if you have the sawdust shavings base bedding, that's better than the straw bedding.
Okay.
But both will work.
All right, all right.
Bedding should be damp. You don't want it to be bone dry. It has to have a little bit of moisture on there. And of course, if you've got a lot of bedding material versus manure, that's probably better, but you don't have to, you know, you don't want it 50-50 manure and bedding.
Okay,
It would be better if it's more like 60-40 or 75-25, something
okay.
like that.
Manure to bedding.
No,
Or bedding
no,
to
bedding
manure.
to
Bedding
manure.
to manure. Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
so you have dry material and you have carbonaceous material that's available to you.
Okay.
So, no, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay.
Okay.
So what do you do once you have all this material available to you? Then you put down a layer that's about 2 feet deep. I'm going to show you some pictures of this in a moment.
Okay.
And it has to be an area big enough so that the animal, when it's laid on there, there's at least 2 feet out beyond it in every direction.
Okay.
Normally, something about 10 by 12 is
Yep.
going to be plenty big,
Okay.
unless, again, you have a really large, like, workhorse.
Right.
So that's the key, is that bed that you lay out has to be large enough so that there's 2 feet beyond the animal in every
Right.
direction.
So it's about the size of a stall, of a good size stall, 12 by 12 or
Okay.
10 by 12,
Yeah.
right? So if you imagine that, then you know what you have to,
Right.
how much you have to come up with.
So
Okay.
then you lay the animal on there, so it's positioned so it's about 2 feet from the outside edges.
And how soon after the horse dies does this need to be done?
As soon as you can,
Within 24 hours, right?
you know, if possible.
Okay.
You know, you obviously don't want to have it laying around in the
Right.
yard for
No.
for long periods
But
of
say you
time.
have trouble finding somebody that has the equipment in order to lift the
Move it,
horse
yep.
and move the horse, right? But within 24 hours works?
Yeah, and actually, as I said, as soon as you can.
Yeah.
So 24 hours would be good.
Yeah.
You may find it's a day or two.
Yeah.
Before you can actually get
You
everything
gotta get
rustled
moving,
up.
yeah. All right.
That's where having a plan ahead of time helps
Planning
you.
is good, yeah.
So then you're going to put cover material over it and make sure that is at least 2 feet of cover over the entire animal.
Okay.
So there's nothing that's closer than 2 feet to the surface.
Okay,
So then you just leave the pile undisturbed. You have 10 to 12 weeks that the activity is going to be going on, doing its own thing. And you should be reduced to just about bone by that time.
okay. Do you have to worry about little animals or,
That's why you
Trying to-
need to have the 2 feet of cover.
okay, and that protects?
Right, and I
The
can
process.
tell you, stories about situations where people had plenty of cover, but they didn't cover one animal enough.
Okay,
And the coyotes found the one that they didn't cover
Right,
enough.
okay.
But right next to it, there's ones with the 2 feet of cover, and no problem.
okay. So if you have other horses, if you have one horse, you have 3 horses, one horse dies, and you do this with one horse, but you have 2 other horses out there, you don't have to worry that you're going to be
Attracting things to
other
it.
animal. Okay,
Right,
good.
Right.
All right.
Yeah, we've had quite a bit of experience with that. So,
Okay.
so then you're going to allow, well, if you have a loader, then after that 10 to 12 weeks, then you can do the mix for the turn part of it.
Okay.
If you do. And then you would allow about 3 months for curing to allow the composting process to finish up.
Okay.
So without the turn, then it's probably going to be a little longer. You're probably going to be 6 months or so out
Okay.
there before you would have a product.
All right. What about time of year? I can see doing something like this in the summer, or at least when there's no snow on the ground. But what about the wintertime?
We've done trials at all times of the year.
Yeah.
And I showed you that photo early on of the thermometer that we took in December 28th. So it was wintertime.
Okay.
And it was still 140 degrees in the pile. So
Okay.
now, if the animal is frozen when it goes into the pile, you've got a little lag time while the animal thaws.
Okay. Okay.
And then it'll get going.
Yeah, and it sounds difficult, but once you have to have, if you have an animal, any animal that you have, whether it's a cat, dog, horse, you have to plan for its future and figure out what you're going to do and do it well.
Right.
And then just carry through that plan. So the idea of looking for a place where this is going to occur, regardless of the time of the year, is a good
Right.
thing.
And have access
Everyone
is-
should do that.
Access is important, especially that time of year.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure.
You have to, pick a spot that you can get to with reasonable effort.
Right.
So,
Or you might have to get an area plowed.
Right,
Right. Okay.
right.
Yeah.
and-
Okay.
and the good thing with composting, though, is once you have that area opened up, the bed of compost material you put on the bottom is going to insulate it from the frozen ground.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
So the composting should proceed pretty naturally.
Okay, and as far as costs go, you have to think about some costs as far as machinery that you might have to get in order to move the horse.
Right.
And maybe in the wintertime it's going to be a little harder. You might need a plow. But other than that, the costs are probably going to be way less than cremation would cost, or the dangers that burial has with it.
Right.
Right?
And you'd have the same expenditures for burial, because you'd have to hire the same machinery
That's right.
to clear a space, and then to if you could, dig through the frost to.
Right, yeah, which isn't something that you can usually, that's easy to do. Okay.
Okay, so this is some shots. Here's a bed that a couple of my teammates, you can see we had a number of different trials going on. This just happened to be one. Just to give you a visual idea of a little
Yeah, it's
bed.
interesting, yeah. It doesn't look bad.
And some of these are kind of graphic.
Yep.
So hopefully
But it's
people
important, yeah.
aren't offended by
No,
some of these.
people shouldn't be offended, you know, this is a learning experience, it's educational.
I can get, okay, there we go.
Okay,
So
so
there's a
there's your
horse laying
horse.
on the bed.
Okay,
And I'm having a hard
are
time
we
with the
having a little
clicker.
trouble with the clicker?
Yeah.
Maybe if you just hit it against the side, maybe just shake the battery up a little bit. Excuse us, this is live
There we
TV.
go. Then
Okay,
this is just
all
another,
right.
another horse
It's
laid
a
on
sad
a-
thing to see, but this is a reality.
Right, and this one's laying on a bed of different material, so you can see
Okay.
it's a different material.
But it was also placed there very carefully.
Right, I
the
mean,
body was
it's
placed
positioned
here, yeah.
in a way so to make sure that it's positioned correctly for the
Because
process.
we want to do it with respect and dignity too, and this allows us to do that.
And
Point this way.
Is this the shot that you wanted? Are we still having trouble with the clicker?
yeah,
is this the
yeah,
shot
this
that should
no,
come?
so this is just showing the animal I just showed you.
Okay,
And now they're putting cover material on.
okay,
And so you can see the material's hot that we're putting on, so we're
Right.
starting with a hot material.
okay.
And then the pile's almost complete.
So you would
and
have to
they're-
hire somebody to come in with,
Right.
that's a tractor, right?
Yeah, this is a tractor
Okay.
with the bucket loader on it. And so you
Okay.
can see there's a pile that's pretty much completed. He's just putting the finishing touches on.
Pretty simple
Yeah,
to do.
yeah, it's a simple process.
Yeah? Okay,
And then I wanted to show you, on these trials that we've done, we track temperatures throughout. So, so here's 2 horses that were done in municipal biosolids, and you can see temperatures in there got up to over 150, and it was up over 130 for weeks.
yep,
So it was, cooking away. This
Yep.
is and you notice what the date it says started December 17th, 2004.
okay.
So this was a wintertime trial, and still got to be in temperatures, over 130 and some close to 160.
Okay. So you don't have to worry about the heat. The heat's there.
I mean, generally, it's going to heat. And here's another one where we did some horses using horse bedding.
Okay.
Again, you can see we got some high temperatures, over 130, close to 140, before it started to cool down, but continued on for some time.
3, 5.
There's yet another one. This was started in September. We had temperatures over 150 in the pile, and then, of course, it cools down over time. This is 2 horses done in the sawdust, and the point to make here is that the one started in October versus the one that started in August. You did see cooler temperatures in the outside of the pile in the October one, but you still got the high temperatures in the core, similar to what you got in August.
Okay. And if people would have to bury more than one animal at a time, you have to do it one pile per horse. You wouldn't put 2 horses together and put them.
No, you could.
You could do that.
You could.
Okay.
And in fact,
So you could bury them together.
right,
yeah.
they could
Or
go
not
together.
bury, that was the wrong, compost them
Right,
together.
and we did that with some, well, the one I just showed you, the 2 horses were, one was laying down, the other one was laying, so they were kind of like spooning.
Yeah.
But it was on top of the legs of the first one.
Right.
Which allowed us to make better use of the amount of material that we were using, so it was more efficient use of
Okay,
it.
yep.
And so you had a little bit bigger pile, but we didn't need to use double the amount of material to do the process.
Right, right. And for some reason, some people, if they have two horses that die, they might want to be able to put them together to do that process.
Now, pile maintenance is also important, though. Once the pile is built, you need to check the pile for about 2 weeks, because what's going to happen is that the material will settle and there'll be cracks will appear, or maybe it'll slump down a little bit. And so you need to rake the surface, shape the pile back up, fill in any cracks. And I'll just show you. There's a pile that needs maintenance.
Okay, and I'm not really sure why, but I can tell that something's wrong.
Yeah,
So,
see, it should be a nice dome-shaped pile.
Okay.
So the top is kind of settled in, it's got some cracks. That's where you're going to have some odors.
okay,
So if you don't come in and rake that and make a nice round top again,
Okay.
then you could have odors, because the odors will find those cracks and
okay.
it'll work its way up through.
So you don't want to go to the manure pile and get more.
Oh, you could.
You could do that
You
and
could
just
do
put it
that.
on top.
Yep. I mean, the
Okay.
easy thing is just get your garden rake and rake it around. But
Rake
if
it
you have
around, okay.
a wheelbarrow and more material nearby, then you can throw it on.
Okay, all right.
So either way works.
Okay. I was just thinking that maybe it might be difficult, if you're going to be raking, people might be a little bit concerned about what they may be stepping on.
Oh.
I don't know.
Yeah, you would be, you probably have to step up on the side of the pile, but it would just be whatever the bedding is, or whatever
Okay.
the medium is. and
Okay,
so
okay. So because the bodies of the horses, the carcasses are in the center.
They should be well contained. They should be at least 2 feet from the surface.
All right.
So you shouldn't be concerned about stepping on there.
Okay.
The tail of the mane or
Well,
something
yeah.
else, whatever. Now, I show this photo to emphasize the point that emergencies happen. This is from an avian influenza outbreak here in Maine back in 2002. And of course, the news media was there and interviewing the farmer. This is not the scene that you want to see at your farm gate,
Yeah.
but it happens. And we were able to compost all the birds that we euthanized in this event. And then that same concept can be extended to large animals. And here's an event that where we composted a large number of cows, and you can see they're all kind of laid out one
Yes.
next to the other. So we made one big windrow rather than individual piles. This is what I was mentioning earlier.
Oh, okay.
So for emergency composting or emergency situations, composting can be a very effective way to deal with a large number of animals.
Okay.
Because you can be much more efficient in the use of material and use of space.
Yeah, okay.
In those events. And
I'm just curious why, was this an emergency? What type of emergency
well,
was it?
this was actually a simulated emergency.
Okay,
We were simulating what would happen if you had a foot and mouth disease outbreak.
okay.
So these animals did not die of foot and mouth disease.
All right.
They died of other
Causes.
natural causes.
Yeah.
But we treated them as if it was going to be
Okay.
an emergency.
all right. So this is a learning situation,
Right,
and but the animals were dead, and so you composted. Okay.
Right. And we've used this in the current outbreak in the Midwest, where we have literally millions of turkeys and chickens are dying in the Midwest from high pathogenic avian influenza.
Because you were called out there, right?
And-
Was it in May that this
Well,
started
I
happening?
went out first time in April, and then I
Okay.
went in May.
Yep.
And
And you went
worked-
to Iowa originally?
I went to Minnesota and then
That's
to
right.
Iowa.
Okay.
And I worked with a number of farmers on disposing
Very
of their
devastating.
birds.
Yeah.
It's quite a.
Turkeys and chickens and
Yeah, I worked only with turkey farmers, but there were large numbers of chickens
chickens
as well.
too. Yeah.
Right? So
Well, I
so we
can't
were doing
imagine.
this same method
Yep.
using
Well, it seems that
those
it would
birds.
work because, as you're going to talk about later, what's the option if burying probably isn't such a good idea?
No, and especially
Especially
when you're
with
talking
something
about
like this.
millions, when you're talking about millions of birds,
Yeah.
it's definitely not a good situation. So this is just a diagram. This is
Okay.
part of that best management
it-
practices book.
Okay,
It's
so
part,
we have two. We have
Right.
best management practices, and you authored both of these.
I did, yeah.
Okay,
So the best management practices has this diagram that shows how to lay out windrows
okay,
and how to lay out an individual pile, so you can see where the animal is positioned inside the
okay.
pile.
And people can get these from the Department of Agriculture?
That's right. They're
Okay.
available from the department. And this is what I mentioned earlier. This is also part of that best management practices book.
Okay,
That it has the formulas in here for calculating how much material you'd need based on the number of animals, and how much or how long a windrow you would need to lay out based on the number of animals.
okay.
So that's all in that book. And the final thing I want to emphasize that we talk about in the best management practices is doing a compost plan for your farm. And it's actually required of your large dairy farmers. They have to have a disposal plan, which for most of them it's composting. And that plan, it's a good idea even for a small operation.
Yeah.
It's going to tell what approach you're going to use. It's going to tell where on your farm or where on your home site it's going to be. And you can probably identify more than one site because you might use one site if it was spring, summer, or fall, and a different site if it was wintertime.
Okay, right.
It would describe whatever you have available to you. If you have a pad that you could use, some people have a manure stacking pad. They can use that as their compost site.
Okay,
So you would have identified that.
I actually don't know what that is.
A manure stacking pad?
Yeah,
Farms who have stackable dry manure can usually get cost share to help build it would be a concrete pad, usually with some sides on it,
Okay.
on say
A
one or
containment
two
system.
sides, maybe even three sides
Yeah.
would have some push walls.
Okay.
And then they can stack their manure in there to
okay. But it would be a cement
Yep.
floor. Okay,
Yep.
now I know what you're I thought it was something different.
No,
When
no.
you said
no,
pad.
No, well,
I
we say it's a concrete
Okay,
pad,
all
generally.
right, yeah,
So,
okay.
so some farms or some horse operations may have those.
I actually have one.
And so that would be a site that you could use easily. You just have to
That
have
makes a lot of sense, yeah.
space cleared enough because it's not going to be there forever.
Right,
And so you can use that temporarily when the composting is done. Then you can move it from that site and it can go back to its
well, that's great to
original
know.
use.
Yeah, okay,
So the feedstocks, in other words, what are you going to use as your compost medium? Is it going to be bedding? Do you have some other waste feed materials to add to it to supplement it? And or you bring something in from outside if you don't. How are you going to get equipment?
Yeah.
Do you have it yourself, or do you know somebody, or would you contract? And you might, in your plan, might write down 2 or 3 contractors in your area who have that equipment with their phone number. So the
Yes.
day it happens and you're feeling flustered, you're not,
What do I do in a
yeah, what do I
panic?
do in a
Yeah.
panic? It's there. You say,
Yeah.
oh, I can call X, Y, or Z and see if they've got an excavator available
right.
for me. So
Yeah, because I have gone through that before when I lost my first horse. And that was a large animal versus the small animals that you take to your vet, or it's a whole different situation. And it is good to have all that information right there because you do, it's not a time where you can feel sorry for yourself. You
Right.
have to get into action.
Yeah, and I think your plan for, especially for a small operation, can be no more than a page or a page and a half that just answers the questions that you need to answer. So you've answered them ahead of time.
Yes.
That and a map of your property where it was going to happen is probably all you need for a plan.
Yeah, okay.
And the other thing is how are you going to monitor it, and make sure you know that you're going to have to maintain. And so, how am I going to maintain that pile? Do I have material available to fill if I have some cracks appear, or am I going to rake it? How am I going to maintain that?
Okay, okay.
So that's the final piece of
And
it.
this is the end result.
And
This is
the
what we
end.
get from
So,
composting.
right. So when the cycle is done, it goes back to the earth and makes a rich material that's going to start the life cycle again.
Full of wonderful nutrients. And so if that happened, or that came about, and the result was from horses, this is what the outcome would be. Something
Right.
that's usable again, because there's nothing that I can do with these ashes. So this is a wonderful thing. Very positive.
And I just talked to a horse owner just recently who had this done, and then she got all of her compost back. She had it done by a service, but she got all of the compost back, and then she used it on some of her land that she's now happy to say, my horse has now enriched this piece of land, and I'm growing plants, on this.
Things are growing
property.
because of it.
Because of it, exactly.
So with death comes new life. So let me ask you a question. Why did this person decide to have this done elsewhere rather than doing it herself?
Well, at the time, she didn't feel that she had the capability
Okay.
to do it. And, but after that, she said that she kind of was thrown in the fire. She had someone's horse that was being boarded with her that died.
Oh, boy.
And then she ended up composting that horse
Okay.
herself.
Yeah. Okay.
Because she'd gotten more information on the process and figured out how to do it herself.
Yeah.
So.
It's the idea of not knowing or being unsure if you're doing it correctly.
And she was, she was kind of traumatized when her own horse died.
Sure.
She wasn't really ready to pitch in and do it and learn about it at that time.
Right, right. But it was a positive experience.
Right. And so she was really glad to have the horse back. And now she said, whenever I look out, there's my, my horse is
Yes.
now producing something. So.
Yeah, something good, bringing new life.
Right.
Okay. Do we want to talk just a little bit about burial?
I can spend just a minute or two on that. So we'll talk about burial. The main thing about burial is being able to find a site, which is very difficult to find a site that really is suitable. So I'll move on. The site selection is key. So you want to have an upland area. You don't want it where there's standing water, obviously. So you don't want to have something that's got a high seasonal water table. In other
Right.
words, if you've got water table right near the surface, you can be burying the animal in the water table.
Right. And here in Maine, especially on the coast,
It's difficult
that's
to
what
find.
right. And so I don't know, I know a lot of people do bury their horses, and I think a lot of professionals still recommend, like the veterinarians, when they euthanize a horse, sometimes recommend that the horse be buried, but I think maybe they need to get a lot of this information, because that is not always the best thing to do, and it can contaminate the soil, contaminates the water. You talked about the land. And for horse owners, that may not be something that is a problem for them, but just the contamination of the well water in the soil is a very bad thing. And
Right.
if you're going to do anything, you need to try to have information so you do it in the most responsible manner.
Right.
Correct? Okay.
Absolutely. So the process that's laid out for that is you would dig a trench
Right.
where you're going to put the animal, and the bottom of that trench has to be at least 2 feet above bedrock.
That's a
So
whole lot.
now you're making sure that you have enough soil to have the 2 feet from bedrock, the depth for whatever the animal is, plus you need to have at least 3 feet over the top of soil. So in other words, you need about 7 feet minimum
Wow.
of soil depth before you can actually bury.
Yeah.
So now, The rules, the same Chapter 211 rules, have restrictions on where you can bury. And you can see these are some of them that, distance from water bodies, from water supplies, 300 feet from any public water supply or a neighbor's well. You can be within 100 feet of your own well if you're willing to take the risk. But contamination of groundwater is always a concern when you bury because it's so close to the groundwater.
Right, and most people in Maine, most people have wells in
Right.
Maine, correct?
Yeah,
Unless you live
in
within.
rural Maine, I don't know the percentage, but my guess is at least 50% of the population has well water.
Okay. Because that was new to me when I came to Maine. I had no idea what wells really even were. I'd always lived in the suburbs, so I had city water, and then when I came to Maine, it was a completely different situation. So this is something that you need to be.
So everybody needs to be concerned about
And
their own
careful.
water supply.
Yeah, yeah.
And your neighbors, but.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, it's important. Yeah.
So,
As a
so these are
responsible horse
setbacks, and some of the other things that you need to be aware of. You don't want to have it where there's a sand and gravel aquifer, and a lot of areas that's what the water supply is these aquifers that are underground. So if you bury above a sand and gravel aquifer, once the seepage hits the aquifer, then the whole aquifer is tainted.
Okay.
Plus, you don't want to be in a floodplain.
Right.
So there are some things that are significantly issues. And I think, and finally, this is the one I was mentioning earlier. You need to make sure you're at least 12 inches above the water table, which means now you're down 7 feet, but you need 12 inches above any water that's standing in there. And
So that's very complicated.
it is. It's
really.
difficult to find. It's very
Yeah.
difficult to find a site that meets all those requirements and has enough depth of soil to accommodate, especially the large animal.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. When I was doing the research and preparing for the show, for the first show that we had, I tried to talk to some people that had buried their horses, but they were very, they didn't really want to talk about it. They didn't really know a whole lot between the process of grieving and losing their horses and just having and calling someone to come out and dig a hole, basically. I don't believe they even knew how far down they buried the horse. And the other thing that's really important, I think, to stress to people is that the burial process itself, sometimes it takes years, like you said, for the body to decompose.
Right. So, and I mentioned to you a story that a farmer who had some alpacas told me that he had an alpaca die, and he buried the carcass. And it wasn't the 6 feet, it was much less than that.
Yeah.
So it was nearer the surface. And a University of Maine professor brought his class because they wanted to excavate and look at the skeleton. And this was a year or two later. And when they did the excavation, they discovered they still had a whole alpaca
Yes.
in the soil.
Yeah.
And so they ended up, just burying it again.
Right.
And were unable to examine the skeleton
Yeah.
because it wasn't the skeleton.
Yeah, but that was good information because otherwise, how would you know?
Right.
And then there was another story about, I think someone lost their horse. The horse died, and the vet, with goodwill, recommended that she bury the horse. And something, I don't know what happened, but she had to exhume the body and rebury the horse because it wasn't done properly. So a whole lot of things can happen. So that's why it's important to be educated and have all this information. And composting, between the first show that we did and the second show and this show, I'm much more comfortable talking about the whole process and just being realistic about what I may have to do if one of my horses dies, because the whole process of dying isn't something that we like to talk about, but it's a fact of life and it's a reality. We need to try to deal with it as well as we can, and if we can produce something that's positive and something that actually is nourishing and full of nutrients, it's much better than causing a whole lot of havoc and chaos. I would say.
That's correct.
Right?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's a really pretty picture too, and that's probably something that you can look at when you think about what you have to do or what you may end up doing when you compost. You can visualize something like that.
Right. I mean that's the completing the cycle.
Yes.
The animal ate the crops and through its lifetime, and then when it was done, it contributes to the life of the crop.
Right. And then what we have to remember too is, like with people, the spirit isn't there; it's the body. So we have two different things. So, Bill, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Thank you so much for this. Is a great presentation. A lot of information.
I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah. I want to make sure that people know that we did our first show, and it is on YouTube. It's on BLIXX Horses and also under Steve Poulos, if they want to look that up, because we have more information there on a little bit more on burial. It was the introduction to all of this. So that might be an interesting show. We also talked about your pets, which were your cats. And so if people want to look at that show, before they see this show, they'll get more information. And thank you very much for coming. I
welcome.
really appreciate it. I've learned a lot. And I've also learned to try to get through some of the difficulties that you have to overcome when you have these large animals, which is very different than having a dog or a cat. And just
Absolutely.
driving them to your vet. You know, you can't put your horse in your car
No.
or your truck. So thank you for joining us. And I want to let everybody know that we're going to have our next show is going to be with Dr. Cook, part 2 with Dr. Cook, the horse's best interest on Bit It or Bitless. So please tune in for that. And in the meantime, remember to enjoy your horse, care for your horse, and keep your horse. I'm your host, Gabriela Rodriguez, saying goodbye. Thanks for joining us.